Imagine hiring someone to play the role of your wife for just 1 week, expecting nothing more than a simple arrangement. But what if, by the end of that week, everything you thought you knew about her, and even about yourself, changed in ways you never imagined? What she did on the last day left him completely shocked, and it will leave you speechless too. Stay tuned to find out how this unbelievable story unfolds. The idea had seemed simple enough at first. Alexander, a successful businessman in his mid-30s, had grown tired of attending high-profile events alone. He was always the odd man out, standing in a sea of couples while enduring the subtle yet judgmental glances from his colleagues and competitors. Everyone in his circle seemed to have a picturesque life, complete with a beautiful spouse by their side, while Alexander remained the eligible bachelor who, despite his wealth and success, had yet to settle down. It wasn't that he hadn't He had dated numerous women over the years, but none of the relationships ever seemed to last. His busy schedule, the pressures of his career, and the constant travel made maintaining a long-term relationship difficult. Eventually, he stopped trying altogether, focusing instead on his business and personal success. But as the years passed, the loneliness began to creep in, and the expectations from society only grew louder. That's when the idea came to him. If he couldn't find a genuine partner to accompany him to these events, why not hire one? It wasn't as outrageous as it sounded. High-profile individuals in his world often hired companions to maintain appearances, and in his mind, it was simply a business transaction. No strings attached, no emotions involved, just a mutually beneficial arrangement. Alexander scoured the internet, searching for a discreet agency that could provide what he needed. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon a reputable service that specialized in providing companionship for high-end clients. The process was straightforward. He would hire someone to play the role of his wife for 1 week, accompanying him to several key events, dinners, and meetings. She would be well-versed in the art of conversation, elegant in her appearance, and, most importantly, understand that this was a strictly professional arrangement. After a brief consultation with the agency, they assured Alexander that they had the perfect candidate for him. Her name was Sophie, a woman in her late 20s who had experience in social settings, was intelligent, and knew how to navigate the upper echelons of society with grace. Alexander was impressed with her portfolio. She seemed to have the perfect blend of charm and professionalism. The deal was made. Sophie would be his wife for the week, attending the necessary events, playing the part convincingly, and in return, she would be generously compensated for her time. It was a win-win situation, or so Alexander thought. When the day arrived, Alexander found himself feeling more nervous than he expected. He wasn't sure why. This was just a business transaction after all, but as he waited for Sophie to arrive at his apartment, he couldn't help but wonder what she would be like in person. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. When Alexander opened the door, he was momentarily speechless. Sophie stood before him, her posture confident yet relaxed, dressed elegantly in a simple black dress that exuded sophistication. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence and a hint of amusement, as if she could sense his hesitation. "Mr. Alexander?" she asked, her voice soft yet steady. "That's me," Alexander replied, quickly composing himself. He extended a hand, which she shook with a polite smile. "Sophie," she introduced herself. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of reviewing the details of our schedule for the week. I believe we'll be attending a charity gala this evening." Alexander blinked, impressed by her level of preparation. "Yes, that's right," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I appreciate your attention to detail." Sophie smiled again, this time more warmly. "I like to make sure everything runs smoothly. After all, for the next week I'll be your wife. It's important that we're on the same page." Her professionalism put Alexander at ease, and soon they were discussing the events they would attend and how they would present themselves as a couple. Sophie's approach was methodical, asking him about his personal preferences, their backstory, and how he wanted their dynamic to appear in front of others. It was clear that Sophie had done this before, and her confidence in the role was reassuring. That evening, they attended the charity gala together. As they walked into the grand ballroom, arm in arm, Alexander couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Sophie blended in effortlessly with the crowd, engaging in polite conversation with his colleagues, smiling at the appropriate moments, and even charming the most difficult personalities in the room. She was everything he had hoped for: elegant, poised, and completely believable as his wife. Throughout the evening, Alexander noticed how easily Sophie navigated the room, as if she had been a part of his life for years. There was no awkwardness, no forced interactions. In fact, the more time they spent together, the more natural it began to feel. For the first time in a long while, Alexander didn't feel like the odd one out at these events. With Sophie by his side, he felt complete. By the end of the evening, Alexander was genuinely impressed. As they returned to his apartment, he couldn't help but praise her for how well she had handled herself. "You were incredible tonight," Alexander said as they stepped inside. "I have to admit I was a little nervous about how this would all play out, but you exceeded my expectations." Sophie smiled, unbuttoning her coat and hanging it up. "Thank you. I'm glad everything went smoothly. But this is only the beginning, Mr. Alexander. We still have a week ahead of us." She was right, of course. The gala had been just the first of many events they would attend together over the next several days. But after seeing how well the evening had gone, Alexander felt confident that the rest of the week would be just as seamless. As the days went by, Sophie and Alexander fell into an easy routine. Each morning they would review their schedule, discuss the day's events, and plan how they would present themselves in public. Sophie continued to impress him with her intelligence, charm, and professionalism. She had an uncanny ability to read people, knowing exactly what to say to put them at ease or win them over. But as the week progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Alexander found himself looking forward to their time together, not just at the events, but in the quieter moments as well. They would often sit together after an event, sharing a glass of wine and talking about their day. Sophie had a way of making him feel at ease, and their conversations, which had started out as purely professional, became more personal. It wasn't long before Alexander realized that he was enjoying Sophie's company far more than he had anticipated. She was more than just a hired companion. She was thoughtful, witty, and in many ways a kindred spirit. He found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone in years, sharing stories about his childhood, his struggles in building his business, and even his fears about the future. Sophie listened intently, offering insights and advice that surprised him. She wasn't just playing a role, she was genuinely interested in what he had to say. And the more time they spent together, the more Alexander began to see her not just as a business arrangement, but as someone who truly understood him. By the time they reached the final day of their agreement, Alexander was conflicted. The week had gone by far too quickly, and he wasn't ready for it to end. Sophie had become more than just a hired wife. She had become someone he cared about, someone he could see himself with beyond their temporary arrangement. But he knew that once the week was over, she would move on to her next assignment, and their time together would become nothing more than a distant memory. On the last day, they attended a lavish dinner party hosted by one of Alexander's most important clients. As always, Sophie played her part perfectly, charming the guests and ensuring that the evening went smoothly. But there was a tension in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that their time together was coming to an end. As the night drew to a close, Alexander found himself alone with Sophie in the quiet of his apartment. The week was officially over, and it was time to say goodbye. But before he could thank her for her work and wish her well, Sophie did something that left him completely speechless. As Alexander stood in the living room, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. The week with Sophie had flown by faster than he could have imagined, and now that it was coming to an end, he felt a sense of loss he hadn't anticipated. He had grown accustomed to her presence, her laughter, and the easy way they conversed about everything from work to life's deeper questions. Sophie had become more than just a hired companion. She had become someone he deeply cared about, though he hadn't admitted it to himself until now. Sophie, standing across from him, seemed composed as usual. But Alexander noticed something different in her demeanor. She wasn't as detached or formal as she had been on the first day. Her posture was more relaxed, and there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Sophie," Alexander began, unsure of how to navigate the inevitable goodbye. "This week has been different. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did." She smiled gently, her gaze meeting his. "I didn't expect it to be this way either." He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. The arrangement was over, but the connection they had built over the week didn't feel like something that could be easily dismissed. "I was wondering," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "if maybe we could stay in touch. Outside of this." Sophie's smile faltered, and she looked away for a moment as if weighing something heavy in her mind. "Alexander," she said softly, "I want to be honest with you." A knot of anxiety twisted in his chest. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite read. Regret, perhaps, or uncertainty. "This week was supposed to be just business, but somewhere along the way, I found myself caring about you more than I should. You're a kind, generous man, and I've enjoyed every moment we've spent together." Alexander's heart lifted at her words, but before he could respond, she continued, "But there are things you don't know about me, things that would change the way you see me. This was meant to be a professional arrangement, nothing more, and I don't want to complicate things for you." Alexander frowned, his confusion growing. "What are you talking about, Sophie? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I've gotten to know you this past week, and I want to know more." Sophie looked at him, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. "That's just it, Alexander. You don't know the real me. The person you've spent this week with is a version of me that was crafted for this job." "I don't believe that," he said firmly, stepping closer to her. "The conversations we've had, the things we've shared, they weren't just part of some role you were playing. I know they were real." "They were real," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's more to me than what you've seen. There are things in my past that I've tried to move on from. Things I've kept hidden because I didn't think anyone would understand." Her words hung in the air between them, and Alexander could feel the tension rising. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that whatever she was hiding, it didn't change the way he felt about her. But the uncertainty in her eyes stopped him. Sophie was holding something back. Something big. "Sophie," he said gently, "whatever it is, you can tell me. I won't judge you." She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I appreciate that, but this is more complicated than you think. It's not just about who I am. It's about what I did." Before Alexander could ask what she meant, Sophie turned away from him and walked toward the window, staring out at the city lights. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Alexander was left standing in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. Finally Sophie spoke again, her voice distant. "There's something I need to tell you before we say goodbye. Something I should have told you from the beginning." Alexander's heart raced as he waited for her to continue. He could sense the weight of whatever she was about to reveal, and he braced himself for what was coming. "When I took this job," Sophie began, "I was in a bad place. I was running from something, my past, my mistakes, everything that had gone wrong in my life. I saw this as a way to escape, to start fresh, even if only for a short time. But I didn't expect to meet someone like you." Alexander remained silent, his mind racing. He had sensed from the start that Sophie was more than just a professional companion, but he hadn't expected her to be carrying such a heavy burden. "I'm not who you think I am," Sophie continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Before I started working for the agency, I was involved in something dangerous. I made choices that I regret, choices that hurt people I cared about. And when things fell apart, I had no one left to turn to." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. "What kind of choices?" Sophie turned to face him, her expression filled with regret. "I got involved with the wrong people, people who were doing illegal things. I didn't realize it at first, but by the time I found out, it was too late. I was already in too deep." She paused, her eyes searching his for understanding. I thought I could get out, but it wasn't that simple. They threatened me, and I had to leave everything behind. That's when I started working for the agency. It was the only way I could survive. Alexander's mind reeled as he tried to process what she was telling him. He had known that Sophie was carrying something from her past, but this was far more than he had expected. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? He asked quietly. Sophie looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Because I didn't want you to see me differently. I didn't want you to think I was a bad person. I don't think you're a bad person, Alexander said softly, taking a step toward her. Everyone makes mistakes, Sophie. What matters is what you've done since then. She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. You don't understand, Alexander. The people I was involved with, they haven't forgotten about me. They're still out there and I'm still running. Alexander's heart clenched as he realized the gravity of the situation. Sophie wasn't just dealing with a troubled past, she was still in danger. And now, her time with him was coming to an end, meaning she would have to return to that life of uncertainty and fear. Sophie, he said, his voice filled with determination. You don't have to run anymore. I can help you. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. What are you talking about? I have resources, connections, Alexander said, his mind racing with possibilities. I can help you get out of this. You don't have to keep running. Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I appreciate what you're saying, but it's not that simple. These people, they're dangerous. If they find out that I've been in contact with anyone from my past, they'll come after me, and anyone who tries to help me. I don't care, Alexander said firmly, closing the distance between them. I'm not going to let you face this alone. Sophie stared at him, her tears flowing freely now. Why would you do that for me? Because I care about you, Alexander said, his voice raw with emotion. This week wasn't just a business arrangement for me. I've gotten to know the real you, and I don't want to lose that. For a moment, Sophie said nothing, her emotions overwhelming her. She had spent so long hiding from her past, so long believing that she was alone, that the idea of someone caring about her, of someone wanting to help her, seemed impossible. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she saw the sincerity in his words, the genuine concern he had for her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. I don't know if I can ever get out of this, she whispered, her voice trembling. But if you're willing to try, I'll trust you. Alexander reached out, gently wiping away her tears. We'll figure it out together, he promised. You're not alone anymore. As the tension in the room shifted, Sophie took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the weight of Alexander's words. It wasn't over yet. There was still danger looming, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time in years, Sophie didn't feel like she had to face it all on her own. She had found something unexpected in Alexander, something more than just a temporary escape. And now, with his support, maybe, just maybe, she could finally break free from the past that had haunted her for so long. The decision to stand by Sophie wasn't one Alexander had taken lightly. As the final day of their arrangement came to a close, the gravity of what he had just promised hit him. He wasn't only extending the companionship they had shared for a week, he was stepping into her complicated, dangerous world. But for some reason, none of that mattered. All Alexander could think about was Sophie's vulnerability, her strength, and the fact that he couldn't simply let her disappear from his life. The next morning, the atmosphere in Alexander's apartment was different. Where there had once been a sense of formality, there was now an unspoken intimacy between them. Alexander had made his choice, and Sophie had placed her trust in him. They both knew that the days ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to face them together. Sophie paced the living room, her thoughts racing. I've spent years looking over my shoulder, she said quietly. I thought I could run forever, but I was wrong. I need to stop. I need to end this once and for all. Alexander watched her, his heart aching for the weight she carried. He knew that his life, as complicated as it was, didn't come close to the danger she was facing. "We'll find a way," he said, trying to sound confident. "But we need to be smart. I have a friend who works in private security. He specializes in helping people disappear. I think he can help us figure out how to handle this." Sophie nodded, though the tension in her body remained. "I don't know how you've stayed calm through all of this," she said with a half-smile. "Most people would have run the other way by now." Alexander smiled faintly. "Well, I'm not most people." A sense of relief passed between them, though it was short-lived. They were still in the thick of things, and now that Sophie had told Alexander the truth about her past, they needed to act quickly. Every minute they spent doing nothing felt like a minute closer to danger. As they began making plans, Alexander reached out to his contact in private security, a man named Gregor, who had helped him with discrete matters in the past. Gregor was efficient and well-connected. He had a reputation for getting things done no matter how complicated. When Gregor arrived at Alexander's apartment later that afternoon, he took one look at Sophie and immediately understood the situation was more than just a routine security issue. "Alexander," Gregor said, his expression serious, "if this is as dangerous as it sounds, we need to move fast. These types of people don't just go away. They track, they follow, and if they feel threatened, they retaliate." Sophie, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looked up, her expression hardened. "I know what they're capable of. I've seen it firsthand." Gregor nodded, his face grim. "We need to put a plan in place, one that ensures your safety, Sophie, while also making it look like you've disappeared. These people will come looking for you, and when they do, they need to find nothing." The tension in the room grew thick, but Sophie didn't back down. She had spent years running from her past, and now she was ready to confront it head-on. "I'm ready," she said firmly. Over the next few days, Alexander, Sophie, and Gregor worked tirelessly to create a strategy. They would stage Sophie's disappearance, making it look like she had left town under mysterious circumstances. Gregor would help arrange the logistics, false identities, travel plans, and a safe house where Sophie could lay low until the situation was resolved. But as they planned, an unexpected complication arose. One of the men from Sophie's past, the one she had feared the most, his name was Victor, and he was not just an ordinary criminal. He was powerful, ruthless, and had ties to a criminal network that reached far beyond what Sophie had originally realized. Victor had found out that Sophie was still alive, and now he was actively searching for her. Gregor's expression darkened when he heard Victor's name. "This changes everything," he said, pacing the room. "Victor isn't someone we can just avoid. If he's looking for you, Sophie, we need to assume he'll find out where you are sooner or later." Sophie's face paled, but she didn't waver. "Then we need to be one step ahead of him." Alexander, who had been quietly listening, suddenly felt a wave of anger and protectiveness wash over him. "We need to take Victor down," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "He's the one who's kept Sophie running all these years. If we don't deal with him, this will never end." Gregor hesitated. Taking down someone like Victor is no small task. He has connections in law enforcement, politicians in his pocket. It won't be easy. "I don't care how hard it is," Alexander said, his voice steady. "We can't keep hiding forever. I have the resources and you have the expertise. We need to make a move." Sophie looked at Alexander, her eyes wide with both admiration and fear. "Are you sure about this? You could get hurt." Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Gregor used his network to gather information on Victor's whereabouts, while Alexander and Sophie prepared for what would be the final confrontation. It was risky. There was no guarantee they would succeed, and the thought of failure weighed heavily on all of the. But Alexander knew that this was their only chance to end the nightmare once and for all. The plan was set in motion. Gregor had managed to track down one of Victor's safe houses, a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was heavily guarded, but Gregor had a plan to infiltrate the estate and confront Victor directly. The goal wasn't just to escape this time, it was to eliminate the threat entirely. As they drove toward the mansion, the tension in the car was palpable. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling slightly as she stared out the window. "I never thought I'd be doing this," she whispered. Alexander reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to get through this," he said, "and when it's over, you'll never have to run again." Sophie nodded, but the fear in her eyes was clear. She knew what they were up against, and she wasn't naive about the danger. When they arrived at the mansion, Gregor parked the car a few miles away, and they approached on foot, keeping to the shadows as they moved closer to the estate. The night was dark, and the air was thick with anticipation. Gregor led the way, his movements swift and silent. He had brought along two of his most trusted men, experts in stealth and combat. They would take out the guards while Alexander and Sophie waited for the signal to move in. As they reached the perimeter of the estate, Gregor motioned for them to stop. He signaled to his men, and they disappeared into the night, moving toward the guard posts at the front gate. Minutes passed in tense silence. Alexander could feel Sophie's hand gripping his tightly, her fear barely contained. But just as they began to wonder if something had gone wrong, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Gregor appeared out of the darkness, his expression calm. "The guards are down. We're clear to move in." Alexander nodded, his heart racing as they approached the mansion. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The plan was simple: confront Victor, force him to back off, and ensure that Sophie's safety would never be compromised again. But as they entered the mansion, it became clear that things weren't going to go as smoothly as they had hoped. They found Victor in the study, sitting at a grand desk, surrounded by several armed men. His presence was intimidating, but Alexander refused to back down. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Victor," Alexander said, "this ends now." Victor looked up, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. "Ah, Alexander, I've been expecting—" The room grew still, and Sophie's grip on Alexander's hand tightened. They had walked straight into a trap. As Victor's chilling smile spread across his face, the gravity of the situation hit Alexander and Sophie like a freight train. They had expected danger, but walking into a trap was something they hadn't fully prepared for. The air in the room thickened with tension as Victor's armed guards stood ready, their eyes trained on Alexander, Sophie, and Gregor. Gregor's men had done their job taking out the exterior guards, but none of them had anticipated this many men inside. Victor wasn't just powerful. He was prepared, calculating, and above all, ruthless. Alexander's pulse quickened, but his resolve didn't waver. He had made a promise to Sophie, a promise to stand by her and protect her from the life she had been running from, and he wasn't about to let Victor destroy that. "I don't know what you think this is," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the growing dread, "but it's over. You've hunted Sophie long enough, and it ends tonight." Victor chuckled, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. "Over?" he mused, as if the idea was laughable. "You think you can just walk in here, make demands, and leave? You don't know who you're dealing with, Alexander. This is bigger than her, bigger than me, even bigger than you." Sophie took a small step closer to Alexander, her face pale but determined. "You're wrong, Victor. It's not bigger than us. It's about the choices we make, and I'm done letting you control my life." For a moment, Victor's expression hardened, and the mask of amusement slipped. "You never understood, did you?" he said coldly. "You could have had it all. You were one of us, Sophie, but you threw it all away. Now you want to run to this man?" He gestured to Alexander, "as if he can protect you from what's coming." Sophie stood tall, despite the fear pulsing through her. "I'd rather have nothing and be free than live under your control." Victor's eyes narrowed, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Alexander could sense that they were moments away from an explosion, something violent, something irreversible. He glanced at Gregor, whose expression remained unreadable, but focused. Gregor had been in tight spots before, and Alexander knew he was calculating their next move. But before anyone could act, Victor leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk in front of him. "You don't get it, do you? You don't just walk away from people like me. I've allowed you to run for this long because it amused me. But if you think you're going to waltz in here and take her from me, you're mistaken. This ends when I say it ends." Victor snapped his fingers, and two of his guards stepped forward, their weapons drawn. Time slowed. Alexander's body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to protect Sophie. But Gregor was faster. In one fluid motion, Gregor and his men sprang into action, disarming the guards before they could even pull the trigger. The sound of scuffling and gunfire echoed through the room, and within seconds the guards were neutralized, their weapons clattering to the floor. Victor remained calm, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He hadn't expected resistance like this, not from someone like Alexander, and certainly not from a man like Gregor. "This isn't over, Victor," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're leaving and you're going to stay out of our lives. If you come after Sophie again, you won't get a second chance." Victor's smile returned, but this time, it was more sinister, more menacing. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You haven't seen the last of me." Alexander, Sophie, and Gregor began to back toward the door, keeping their eyes on Victor. But just as they were about to exit the room, Victor spoke again, his voice dripping with venom. "She'll never be free, Alexander. No matter how far you run, no matter how deep you hide her, I will find her. She belongs to this world and you'll never change that." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he refused to give Victor the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he took Sophie's hand, guiding her out of the mansion and into the safety of the night. In the drive back to the city was silent. The tension from the encounter with Victor still hung in the air like a dark cloud. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. She had known that confronting Victor would be dangerous, but hearing his chilling words, knowing that he wouldn't stop, left her feeling more vulnerable than ever. Alexander's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the scene in his mind. They had managed to escape, but for how long? Victor was relentless, and now that he knew Sophie had help, he wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted. "We'll figure this out," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "We'll find a way to protect you, Sophie. I won't let him hurt you." Sophie turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "You don't have to do this, Alexander. This is my fight. You've already done more for me than anyone ever has." "This isn't just your fight anymore," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "We're in this together." As they pulled into the garage of Alexander's apartment building, the weight of the situation settled over both of them. They were no longer just dealing with a business arrangement or a fleeting relationship. This was life and death, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Gregor stayed behind to continue coordinating security measures, ensuring that they had a safe place to regroup and plan their next move. Alexander and Sophie made their way up to the apartment, both of them too exhausted to speak. Once inside, Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Alexander sat beside her, pulling her into his arms as she buried her face in his chest. For a long moment they sat like that, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears and emotions. But as the minutes passed, Sophie's breathing began to slow, and she pulled away slightly, looking up at Alexander. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been running for so long, and I never thought anyone would care enough to help me." Alexander's heart ached at her words. He had always been the type of man who kept his emotions guarded, never allowing anyone to get too close. But with Sophie, something had changed. He had let her in, and now, he couldn't imagine a life without her. "You don't have to run anymore," Alexander said softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I'll protect you. We'll figure this out. Sophie nodded, though her eyes were still clouded with uncertainty. But what if he's right? She asked quietly. What if I can never be free? Alexander shook his head, his voice filled with conviction. You will be. I promise you that. Over the next few days, they worked with Gregor to secure a new safe house and put additional security measures in place. Sophie's old life was officially over. They destroyed all traces of her previous identity, creating a new one that would allow her to move forward without the constant fear of being found. But even with the new identity, the tension between them remained. Victor's words lingered in Sophie's mind, a constant reminder that no matter how far she ran, there would always be a part of her tied to that dangerous world. Alexander, on the other hand, refused to let fear dictate their future. He was determined to create a life with Sophie, one free of the shadows that had haunted her for so long. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. What had started as a temporary arrangement had turned into something real, something meaningful. Alexander and Sophie found solace in each other, knowing that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. But despite the progress they had made, there was still one final challenge to overcome. Victor was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. And until he was gone, Sophie and Alexander would never truly be free. The weeks after their confrontation with Victor were filled with tension. Sophie and Alexander had settled into their new routine, living under tight security and constantly on edge, waiting for Victor to make his next move. But even with Gregor's expert team protecting them, the unease lingered. It was as if they were living in the eye of a storm, knowing that at any moment the winds could shift and chaos would return. Despite the looming threat, Alexander and Sophie's bond had deepened. They had gone from strangers in a business arrangement to partners in survival. Their relationship was no longer bound by the terms of a contract. It had evolved into something real and meaningful. Alexander found himself caring for Sophie more than he ever thought possible. And Sophie, who had spent years running and hiding, finally felt like she had someone she could trust. Someone who wouldn't abandon her when things got tough. But the danger of Victor still loomed. They both knew it was only a matter of time before he made his move. Victor wasn't the type to let things go, and if there was one thing they had learned, it was that he always found a way to strike back. Sophie's fear of never being truly free began to creep back in, even though Alexander tried to reassure her every day. Then one night, everything changed. It was late and the apartment was quiet. Gregor's team had been extra vigilant, and they had fortified their security to the point where Alexander and Sophie were beginning to feel a semblance of normalcy. But as the city outside their windows hummed with the sounds of traffic, a new sound pierced the stillness, an alarm followed by a series of rapid beeps from the security system. Alexander shot up from the couch, his body immediately tense. Sophie, sitting beside him, froze. Their eyes met, and in that split second, they both knew what was happening. Victor had found them. Gregor burst into the room, his face grim. "We've got trouble. They've breached the outer perimeter." "How many?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. "Too many," Gregor replied. "But we're ready. We have reinforcements on the way." Sophie's heart raced as the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't just a scare. This was it. The final confrontation. Victor was coming for her, and there was no running this time. "We need to get you both out of here," Gregor said, pulling out a set of keys. "We have a safe house outside the city, but we need to move now." Alexander nodded, but as he stood, he felt Sophie's hand grip his arm. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear but also resolve. "I'm tired of running," she said quietly. "I can't live like this anymore. We have to face him." Alexander's heart twisted at her words. He knew she was right, but the thought of putting her in danger again made him hesitate. Still, they couldn't hide forever. Victor would never stop, and Sophie deserved to live without the shadow of fear hanging over her. "We'll face him," Alexander said, his voice firm. "But we'll do it on our terms." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Gregor's team mobilized quickly, setting up a perimeter around the building and securing the exits. They were prepared for a fight, but the tension in the air was palpable. Sophie and Alexander were moved to a secure room in the building's basement, where they could monitor the situation from a set of screens displaying the security cameras outside. As they watched, the footage showed a group of armed men approaching the building, Victor's men. They were methodical, well-trained, and clearly NT. Gregor's team held their ground, but it was clear that this was going to be a fierce battle. "This is it," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll get through this," he said, though his own heart was pounding in his chest. "We've come too far to lose now." But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that Victor's men were relentless. They breached the building's outer defenses, and soon gunfire echoed through the hallways. Gregor's team fought back fiercely, but the sheer number of attackers made it a brutal fight. Then, in a move that sent a chill down Alexander's spine, the security cameras showed Victor himself approaching the building, flanked by more armed men. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his expression cold and calculating. This wasn't just a power move, this was personal. He wanted Sophie, and he was willing to tear down everything to get to her. Gregor's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're holding them off, but they're closing in. You need to be ready." Sophie looked at the screen, her face pale but her eyes determined. "This ends tonight," she said, her voice steady. Alexander nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had been in high-stakes situations before, but nothing like this. This was life or death, and for Sophie, he was willing to do whatever it took to keep her safe. As the fighting intensified, Gregor's team managed to hold the line long enough for Sophie and Alexander to make their move. They left the secure room and made their way through the building's hidden passageways, Gregor leading the way. The plan was to draw Victor's attention, forcing him to confront them directly, rather than allowing his men to overwhelm them. It was risky, but it was the only way to end this once and for all. They emerged from the passageway into a large open courtyard at the back of the building. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of gunfire and the occasional shout from one of Gregor's men. But as they stepped into the courtyard, they saw him. Victor stood in the center, waiting for them. He smiled when he saw Sophie, his expression cold and menacing. "There you are," he said, his voice calm but filled with malice. "I've been looking forward to this." Sophie's hand tightened around Alexander's, but she didn't flinch. "It's over, Victor," she said, her voice steady. "You're not going to control me anymore." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn, Sophie. But you should know by now that there's no escaping this. You belong to me." Alexander stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And if you want to get to her, you'll have to go through me." Victor's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "I've built an empire on fear and power. What do you have?" "Enough," Alexander replied, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, with a swift movement, Victor signaled his men to move in. The fight was on. The courtyard erupted into chaos as Victor's men clashed with Gregor's remaining team. Gunfire rang out, and the air was thick with the sounds of battle. But through it all, Alexander kept his focus on Victor. This was the man who had made Sophie's life a living nightmare, and he wasn't going to let him get away with it. Sophie stood beside Alexander, refusing to be a bystander in her own fight. She had spent too long running, too long hiding, and now it was time to stand her ground. Victor, seeing that his men were being overrun, lunged toward Sophie, a knife glinting in his hand. But before he could reach her, Alexander intercepted him, grabbing his wrist and twisting the knife from his grasp. The two men grappled, their movements quick and brutal. "You're done, Victor," Alexander growled, his grip tightening. Victor struggled, his face contorting with rage. You have no idea what you're getting into, he spat. But Alexander wasn't listening. With one final, forceful move, he overpowered Victor, throwing him to the ground. Gregor's team rushed in, securing the scene and disarming the remaining men. As Victor lay on the ground, defeated, Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding. She looked down at him, her face resolute. "It's over," she said softly, but with a strength that resonated through the night. "You don't own me. You never did." Victor glared up at her, his power broken, his empire crumbling around him. He had lost. The fight was over. Victor's men were subdued, and the authorities were called in to take control of the situation. As the dust settled, Sophie and Alexander stood side by side, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. They had won. The adrenaline from the battle slowly began to wear off as the reality of what had just transpired sank in. The once chaotic courtyard was now quiet, except for the occasional murmur of Gregor's team as they secured the area and waited for the authorities to arrive. Victor lay on the ground, handcuffed, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The empire he had built on fear and manipulation was crumbling before his eyes. For Sophie, the moment was surreal. After years of running, hiding, and living in constant fear, the man who had controlled her life was now powerless. She stood over him, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted her for so long had come to an end, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could finally breathe. Alexander was by her side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He could feel the tension leaving her body as she realized the gravity of what they had accomplished together. For Alexander, the fight had never been just about protecting Sophie. It had been about something much deeper. He had found someone worth fighting for, and he had done everything in his power to keep her safe. Now that it was over, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. Sophie looked up at Alexander, her eyes filled with emotion. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "It's really over." He smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "It's over," he confirmed. "You're free, Sophie. You don't have to run anymore." For a long moment they stood there in the quiet aftermath, holding on to each other as the weight of the past weeks, months, and years slowly lifted. The fight had been hard, the stakes high, but they had emerged victorious. And as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, it felt like a new beginning for both of them. Later that morning, after the authorities had arrived and Victor had been taken into custody, Sophie and Alexander returned to the apartment. The tension that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and peace that neither of them had felt in a long time. Sophie walked through the apartment slowly, taking in the familiar surroundings with new eyes. Everything felt different now. The constant fear that had followed her was gone, and in its place was a sense of possibility. For so long she had been living in survival mode, unable to think beyond the next day, the next moment. But now, for the first time, she could imagine a future. Alexander watched her from the kitchen, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He could see the change in her, the way her shoulders had relaxed, the way she moved more freely, unburdened by the weight of her past. He had always admired her strength, but seeing her now, free from the chains that had bound her, made him feel an even deeper connection to her. As Sophie turned to face him, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They had been through so much together, and now they were standing on the other side of it stronger than ever. "I don't know how to thank you," Sophie said softly, breaking the silence. "For everything. You didn't have to stay, but you did. You fought for me when no one else would." Alexander shook his head, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. I didn't do this for a reward. I did it because I care about you, because I want you to have the life you deserve." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she reached for his hand. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, someone who would stand by me through all of this." You've given me hope when I didn't think I had any left. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her close. You're not alone anymore, he whispered. We'll figure out the rest together. In the days that followed were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. With Victor behind bars and his criminal network dismantled, Sophie's life had finally returned to a sense of normalcy. But the question that lingered in both of their minds was what came next. Sophie had spent so long running from her past that she had never stopped to think about what she wanted for her future. And now, with the freedom to make her own choices, she found herself at a crossroads. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, Sophie broached the subject that had been on both of their minds. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do now, she said quietly, her gaze focused on the skyline. Alexander turned to her, his expression curious. What do you want? Sophie hesitated for a moment, then sighed. For so long, my life has been about surviving. I've never had the chance to think about what I actually want, what makes me happy. But now, I feel like I have that chance, and I don't want to waste it. Alexander nodded, understanding the weight of her words. You deserve to live your life on your own terms, Sophie. Whatever you decide, I'll be here to support you. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Thank you, she said softly. I've been thinking about starting over somewhere new, maybe moving to a different city, building a new life. But I don't want to do it alone. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He had always known that Sophie might want to leave the city after everything that had happened, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. Still, he wasn't about to let her go without a fight. You don't have to be alone, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. I told you I'd stand by you, and I meant it. Wherever you go, I want to be with you. Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. Are you sure? You have your business here, your life. My life is with you now, Alexander interrupted gently. Everything else can be figured out. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she realized the depth of his commitment. She had spent so long believing that she had to face everything on her own, that no one would ever truly stand by her. But Alexander had proven her wrong time and time again. He had fought for her, protected her, and now, he was offering her the one thing she had never truly had, a future filled with love and possibility. I don't know what I did to deserve you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Alexander smiled, leaning in to kiss her softly. You don't have to deserve anything, Sophie. You're enough just as you are. As they sat together, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She had Alexander by her side, and with him, she knew she could face anything. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and Alexander made plans to move to a new city, eager to leave the memories of the past behind and start fresh. They found a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town, far from the chaos of the city but close enough to stay connected to the world they knew. For Sophie, the move was more than just a change of scenery. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she was no longer defined by her past, but by the choices she made for her future. And with Alexander by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. On the day they moved into their new home, Sophie stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of the empty rooms filled with potential. She smiled, feeling a sense of excitement and possibility that she hadn't felt in years. This was it, the life she had always dreamed of, but never thought she could have. As Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, she leaned back into him, savoring the moment. "Welcome home," he whispered. Sophie smiled, her heart full. Home, she repeated softly. It was a word that had once felt foreign to her, but now it was the only place she wanted to be. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Several months had passed since Sophie and Alexander made the move to their new home. Far from the chaos and fear that had once dominated their lives, the quiet town where they had settled provided the peace Sophie had longed for. And in this new chapter of their lives, they found something they hadn't expected: contentment. For the first time in years, Sophie felt free. Free from the chains of her past, free from the fear that had once consumed her every waking moment, and free to explore who she truly was outside of the shadows of her former life. Alexander had kept his promise, standing by her side through every step of the transition, supporting her as she adjusted to her new life. Their home, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town, had quickly become a sanctuary. The rooms, once empty, were now filled with warmth and laughter. The garden outside, which Sophie had started tending shortly after they moved in, had become her favorite place to unwind. It was her escape, a symbol of growth and renewal, much like her own journey. She spent hours there, planting flowers and herbs, watching as the fruits of her labor bloomed around her. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Sophie sat on the porch swing, her eyes closed as she listened to the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Alexander joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and sat beside her, their hands naturally finding each other's. "Hard to believe it's been months already," Alexander said, handing her a glass. Sophie smiled, taking a sip of the wine. "It feels like a lifetime ago, but in a good way." He nodded, gazing out at the garden she had lovingly tended to. "You've done amazing things here, Sophie. You've built something beautiful." Sophie looked at him, her smile softening. "We've built something beautiful," she corrected gently. "This is as much your home as it is mine." Alexander chuckled. "Maybe, but the garden, that's all you." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence. The peace they had found together was more than she had ever hoped for. After everything they had been through, after all the danger and uncertainty, they had carved out a life for themselves that was filled with love, safety, and possibility. As they sat together in the fading light, Sophie's thoughts drifted to the past. Victor was gone, locked away in a maximum security prison, his criminal empire dismantled piece by piece after his arrest. The authorities had made sure that the remnants of his organization were no longer a threat, and for the first time in years, Sophie could live without looking over her shoulder. It was a strange feeling, this newfound freedom, but it was one she had embraced wholeheartedly. "What do you think comes next for us?" Sophie asked, her voice soft. Alexander smiled, his hand gently squeezing hers. "Whatever you want it to be," he said. "The future is ours to decide." Sophie thought about that for a moment. There was a time when the idea of planning for the future had seemed impossible, when her only goal had been survival. But now, she was free to dream, to imagine a life that wasn't dictated by fear. She and Alexander had already created something special, but there was so much more to explore. "I think," Sophie said thoughtfully, "I'd like to start giving back. After everything that's happened, I feel like I want to help others who've been through similar situations, people who are trying to escape their own shadows." Alexander's eyes brightened at her words. "I think that's a wonderful idea. You'd be amazing at that." Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of purpose settle over her. It was something she had thought about often since their move, how she could use her experiences to help others who were struggling, who felt trapped the way she had once been. Maybe it was through mentorship, or maybe it was through creating safe spaces for those who needed them. Whatever form it took, Sophie knew that she wanted to make a difference. "I want to build something," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "A place where people can come when they have nowhere else to go. A safe haven, like what we've built here." Alexander listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. Sophie's strength, resilience, and compassion had always inspired him, and hearing her talk about her plans for the future only deepened his admiration for her. "We'll make it happen," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." Sophie smiled, her heart full. With Alexander by her side, she knew that anything was possible. Together they had overcome insurmountable odds, and now they were building a future that was rooted in love, trust, and hope. As the months turned into a year, Sophie's dream began to take shape. With Alexander's support, she started a nonprofit organization aimed at helping survivors of abusive and dangerous situations rebuild their lives. The organization, aptly named New Beginnings, became a beacon of hope for those in need, offering resources, counseling, and safe housing for individuals looking to escape their pasts and start anew. Sophie threw herself into the work, using her own experiences as a guide. She connected with others who had been through similar hardships, offering them not only a helping hand, but also a sense of community. It was fulfilling work, and it brought Sophie a deep sense of purpose. Alexander, too, found fulfillment in supporting Sophie's vision. His business continued to thrive, but his heart was fully invested in the life they were building together. He watched with pride as Sophie's organization grew, as she helped more and more people find their own new beginnings. Through it all, their love only deepened. The challenges they had faced together had forged an unbreakable bond, and as they continued to build their life together, they did so with the knowledge that they could face anything as long as they had each other. On the one-year anniversary of the day they had moved into their new home, Sophie and Alexander hosted a small gathering at the house, inviting close friends and colleagues from the nonprofit. It was a celebration of the life they had built and of the community they had created through New Beginnings. As the sun set over the garden, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Sophie stood at the center of it all, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She had come so far from the scared, isolated woman who had once run from her past. Now she was standing tall, surrounded by people who cared about her and who shared her vision for a better future. Alexander watched her from across the yard, his heart swelling with pride and love. He had known from the moment he met Sophie that she was special, but seeing her now, seeing the way she had transformed not only her own life but the lives of so many others, filled him with a sense of awe. As the evening came to a close, Sophie found herself standing alone in the garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the fear she had once lived with, the danger she had faced, and the battles she had fought to reclaim her life. But now, standing in the place she called home, surrounded by love and possibility, she knew that every struggle had been worth it. Alexander joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist as they looked out at the garden together. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Sophie asked, her voice soft. "All the time," Alexander replied, smiling. "It feels like a different life." Sophie nodded, leaning into him. "I'm so grateful," she whispered, "for everything. For you." Alexander kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "I'm grateful too," he said. "For you. For this life we've built together." As they stood there, hand in hand, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, Sophie knew that she had finally found the peace and happiness she had been searching for. The road ahead was still full of unknowns, but with Alexander by her side, she was ready for whatever the future held. Together they had built a life filled with love, hope, and new beginnings. And that, Sophie knew, was the greatest victory of all.